Now, every role in Overwatch 2 comes with their own fair share of difficulties, but one most notably definitely has a challenge, and that is the role of the dive tank. So in this video, we're going to go over 5 things that you need to learn in order to master the dive tank role in Overwatch 2. So let's get straight to it. All that being said, if you enjoy educational content and would love to be a part of a healthy community, then be sure to like, subscribe, and leave your comments down below. And let's get straight to the first point. So playing as a dive tank requires that you have a lot of patience and self-discipline. And the reason why is because as a dive tank, your responsibility is very, very grand in that you are not only there to scout the enemy, but you're also there to put pressure on the enemy via disruption or getting eliminations. But also you're the one who really controls the pace of the game. And all of that requires that you are patient and that you exercise discipline, because a lot of players that I've watched, they just tend to dive in without really thinking of why they're doing it, how they're doing it, when they're doing it, and so on and so forth. And so you need to exercise discipline and patience, because a lot of questions need to be asked before you engage your target. One of which is my target on their cooldowns? Do they still have cooldowns, or are they free for me to punish them? So this is really all about waiting your turn. So waiting your turn essentially means that you're scouting the enemy team, you're seeing who's on their team as far as threats. So the moment you come out of spawn, you're looking to see who's on the enemy team, and you use that information to now determine your next plan of action, which goes right back to waiting your turn. So waiting your turn is assessing the situation and thinking to yourself, okay, what things, or what cooldowns rather, has the enemy team utilized, and once they've utilized it, can I capitalize? So I'll give you a good example. Doomfist, one of his worst counters is of course Ana. Ana can put him to sleep, which then pretty much nullifies his whole entire game plan of using his punch and just getting value for his team. And so if you're not aware as a dive tank to essentially really scout and once again play for your turn, you're going to always dive into an Ana who's going to put you to sleep and you lose value for the rest of your team. So exercising discipline is one of the most vital aspects of mastering tank, most notably dive tank, because once again, there is a lot of information that you need to unravel before you engage. So just to reiterate, your first step as a dive tank when going into a battle is to scout the enemy team. That is the first thing you have to do. Get information about the team, who they're running, why they're running it. Then the second thing you need to be doing is you need to start asking yourself, when's my turn? When can I engage? And the most important thing you have to ask yourself is, after that engagement, who am I to engage? Do I want to engage the backline? Do I want to engage, let's say, a DPS who's out of position? There are a lot of questions you have to always constantly ask yourself. But again, it all comes down to understanding the cooldowns. And then once you've understood the cooldowns, then you can apply pressure by either disrupting the enemy, or you can go in and eliminate the enemy target one by one. So with that, let's move on to the second important point. So now that you've understood the fundamental principles of patience and exercising discipline as a dive tank, now it's important to really learn and master what coordination is all about. And while it might sound simple on paper, it isn't always necessarily the case, because communication is really, really important in the game of Overwatch 2, and it's not always very simple to get the point across when all of your teammates are doing their own thing. So as a dive tank, it's really, really vital here that you communicate what it is that you want to do, whether it's a short ping to your teammates to let them know, hey, I'm going to go after this diva in the backline, or I'm going to go after this Sombra, or I'm going to go after this Ana. You just make a ping or let your teammates know that you're going to go up against this enemy, and what you're allowing them to do is following up on your damage, following up on your attempt to disrupt the enemy team and waste their cooldowns, and just essentially build momentum and give your team the advantage to create space. So this all requires a lot of problem solving. And the reason why this is important is because as a dive tank, you're always constantly trying to problem solve on the fly. You're looking for a problem. The problem is that you see a threat on the enemy team. That threat could be an Ana, that threat can be a Baptiste or a Zenyatta. And so you need to now address that problem and think of ways to solve it. And the best way is, once again, to coordinate an effective game plan with your team to say, okay, this enemy is threatening us. Their DPS, for example, let's say a Cassidy, they're carrying their team. So now you need to think, how can we eliminate this Cassidy, or how can we eliminate this Zenyatta off the battlefield to therefore retake position, regain advantage, and allow for our team to maintain consistent aggression. So learning to master coordination is very, very important as a dive tank. It is one of the more fundamental aspects of dive, and once you learn to master it, you will certainly see greater results in your rank performance. And so all that being said, let's move on to the third point. In the game of Overwatch, risk and reward are two very, very important factors. And with dive tank, you need to be playing very methodical and understanding the risk versus your reward when it comes to your engagements. So why is this really, really important to master? Well, for one, as a dive tank, you are the one, once again, who has to initiate. You're the one who has to engage and either disrupt to create the plays and get the eliminations for your team, and coordinate all of this at the same time to achieve the best results possible. So understanding methodical gameplay is really essential when it comes to really getting the most value for yourself and for the rest of your team. So risk versus reward is imperative. I'll give an example. So let's say that you're playing dive, you're playing Doomfist, and you see an enemy in the backline. And you know that the reward is that you can obviously get the pick for your team, take out an enemy target that's a threat to you, and you can continue to assess the situation moving forward. However, the risk involved is that you don't know what cooldowns the opposing team has against you. So that risk versus reward is quite high, in that the risk is high. In other words, you don't know what the other team has against you to counter you. And so the reward is also going to be very low. So you need to be able to understand and learn how to mitigate risk, so therefore you can earn greater rewards down the road. So all of the things I've already mentioned in the video with regards to patience, coordination, having discipline, all of these tie into being methodical and knowing how to assess risk and reward. And so what you want to be always trying to do is take high risk plays, that is, dive your enemy target, but also get the reward of disrupting, and most importantly, getting the necessary elimination so that you can create space and maintain the momentum. So if you're not doing that, that means you're missing on one of those key components from earlier. Maybe you're impatient, you didn't assess the situation properly, you didn't really wait for your turn, so you didn't play as patient, you weren't as reserved. It's not just about being super aggro, but it isn't also about being too passive. You don't want to be playing too passively, because then you don't get any value, but you don't want to be too overly aggressive, because then you lose the reward versus your risk. The risk being that you took a high risk to do a crazy play, but you ultimately died as a result, and therefore you got no reward. So really try to master the art of understanding what it means to determine risk versus reward, being very methodical about how you approach every single aspect of the game, every single engagement. Really think carefully and ask yourself if the risk is higher than the reward, or if the reward is on the same level as your risk. And once that is in place, then you can take the necessary steps to engage. So that being said, let's move on to the next point. So one of the core focal points of a true dive tank master is one who takes decisive action in all of their approach. These are the players who you see in top 500 These are the players who are consistently getting the picks with making it look easy. And that's because they take decisive action and they have confidence in doing so. The reason why confidence is so important when it comes to playing dive is because you are the one that's the playmaker. You're the one creating the space, you're the one disrupting, you're the one making the eliminations, you're the one essentially coordinating all the plays to allow your team to maintain momentum. And so if you are somebody who is indecisive, that is, you take too long to make decisions, you're very passive, you're too reserved in your approach, oftentimes you're going to miss out on very big opportunities that tanks, especially dive tanks, need to take advantage of. So a good example, we'll go back to Ana since it's the easiest point to make. As Doomfist, the moment you see that Ana loses her sleep dart, you want to be able to take decisive action and capitalize on that opportunity before she gets a chance to re-engage or at least reset her cooldowns to therefore, minimize your pressure. So the moment you see an opportunity, you need to be able to take decisive action, make sure that you are making the correct play with your team, making the right callouts, and therefore capitalize and reset the scenario into your favor. Failure to do so will just basically put you into this vicious cycle of coming out of spawn, feeding, dying, feeding, and dying. And that's because you just didn't have a game plan. You weren't decisive enough. And as a result, the opposing team was able to capitalize on your failures. So it's really, really integral that you understand the difference between a decisive player and an indecisive player, because one who takes action is the one who creates action. They're the ones who get the most wins, they're the most consistent, versus somebody who's pretty lukewarm, hot, or hit or miss. Try not to put yourself in that scenario. Now, granted, we all have our good days and bad days, but to be consistent, confidence is really, really integral, and just being decisive is what really separates the good players from the truly masterful dive tank players. So, all that being said, let's move on to the last point, which once again is a very indispensable trait that you should learn moving forward. So your team is down 2 people. It's 3v5, you're a dive tank, you're still in the fight. What are you going to do? Are you going to continue to engage and try and hold down the fort? Or do you fall back, give up space, and reset the game so that you and your team can reassess and re-engage appropriately? These are all questions you have to ask yourself as a dive tank, because you are the one who was most at risk for your team. Since you are the one who was going into the enemy backline, and you are the one who has to make sure that your line of sight is available for your teammates to see you, most notably your supports, but also for your DPS to follow up on your damage. And a lot of this comes down to critical thinking and asking yourself really important questions on the fly. It isn't just pick Doomfist, pick Winston, dive, get picks, and win. It's really not that simple. There really is a lot of fundamental questions you have to ask yourself, a lot of layers that you have to really, really dig into. And once again, this comes down to enemy cooldowns. It comes down to the enemy team composition, their positioning on the battlefield, what map they're on, whether or not your dive tank choice is capable enough to sustain for long periods of time in the backline if you are going to go for a push. These are all things that you need to be thinking about critically on the fly, because one error in your judgment with any of these dive tanks can really cost you the game, especially because for the most part, dive tanks are quite fragile. Doomfist is very fragile, Winston's very fragile, and D.Va at times, if she's not careful, can also be very fragile. And so with that in mind, you need to really be asking yourself, how can I get the momentum? How can I assess the situation in a way that gives my team the upper hand for most of the game? Well, all of this ties back into the previous 4 tips that I provided with regards to mastering dive. You first need to be patient and have the discipline to not get angry when you lose a fight and to not get upset about making poor plays. See, critical thinking really asks you to take chances, take risks. It's okay to take risks because you really want to push your limits. You want to see what you can do versus what you can't do in an actual game. So if you're just playing very linearly, you're not going to really get too far. You need to be able to have an open mind, take risks when possible, and if you lose, you lose. But at least you know that you've taken a risk that gave you another idea to work on, so therefore you can take that critical thinking, apply it to your next approach, and therefore perhaps it didn't work the first time, but now you can apply a more unpredictable approach to make it work the second time, and so on and so forth. So all that being said, putting all these 5 skills together, you need to have patience. You have to have discipline to know when to make your approach. 2, you want to be able to coordinate your attacks with your team to therefore to get more value. 3, you want to be very methodical, understanding the risk versus the reward. You need to be very decisive in your action. Once you've made the decisive thought in your mind, you have to take action right away. And lastly, all that needs to be really carefully considered, because any small error in judgment can effectively ruin all of the things you've worked so hard for. And so be very critical in terms of your approach. So all that being said, hopefully these 5 traits you have already taken into consideration and you're trying your best to master it. Let me know if you have any more tips down below to share for aspiring dive tank mains. And all that being said, New Warriors, as always, thank you so much for your support. Be sure to follow me on my Discord to keep in touch with me. And of course, like, comment, and subscribe. And take care. Peace.